All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back. Yes, good evening or good morning, I guess, depending on where you are. We've got a fun show today because we've got a guest on with us today. Our guest is Logan Macnair. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. And we also have one of my editors, Neslig, who has been faithfully serving alongside me in this channel of now 9, almost 10 years. Can you believe that, Nestle?
Yeah. Hello.
And then Peter's in the background doing Peter stuff.
Keeping an eye on the Dutch in the chat. So it doesn't get out of hand.
They're always, oh my goodness. And they're speaking fake languages in the chat.
That too.
Don't like that. Yeah, we can't have all this fake language in the chat. Okay, well, hello. Nice to meet you in the virtual world. We have not met before.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting about some of these things. I've been watching some of your stuff and seeing you dip your toes in this world, so I'm happy to provide whatever commentary I can on some of this kind of stuff.
Okay, so in your mind, the stuff that you have seen, been good, been bad? You're like, oh man, this guy's getting it all wrong.
Looks good. I mean, thoroughly researched. That's good. So, I mean, yeah, as far as I can tell, you're doing things right.
Oh, we appreciate it. Did you see the neo-fascism video?
I did, yeah. I did.
Okay, that one. Yeah, we did. We spent a lot of time and effort on that one. The comments have been largely negative on it.
I think anytime you're dealing with this kind of content, that's invariably going to happen. You're going to get people coming out and doing that. So don't be disheartened by that, I would say. Just keep fighting the good fight and ignore that kind of stuff. But...
Oh yeah. We've done, like I said, my background, our background here is biology. And so we've done debates with creationists for years and years, and then kind of branching out into like other types of conspiracies. And there's remarkable similarity among all of them. You know, it's and how and then of course today we're going to talk about how people can take those sorts of conspiracies and then go much further and actually do acts with those conspiracies. But first, please give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm currently a professor of criminology at Douglas College, just outside of Vancouver, Canada, and most of my academic research and doctoral research and everything leading up to it has involved sort of what we might call extremist movements, specifically focusing on kind of online extremist movements. So I've written about, far right spaces and sort of, neo-fascist spaces. And I've written about other sort of extremist fringe groups that are operating online. And I'm predominantly interested in looking at sort of how these groups communicate and how they sort of share their propaganda and spread their messaging, and how they sort of use culture and how they use new media in order to sort of entice people into these movements. And just watching a lot of this stuff develop over the last 10 or so years that I've been actively studying it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I am. So I'll give you a bit of a hint. I'm only 28, and so my first foray into politics was in the 2016 election, for us. And so that was, of course, the presidential election when when Hillary lost to Trump.
That's as good as place as any to start with a lot of this modern contemporary stuff, because we can trace a lot of it back to kind of what was happening 2015, 16-ish for sure. So if you were around then and if you were paying attention then, you'll see the kind of seeds of a lot of the stuff that is now developing quite strongly.
Yeah, so like things like that would have preceded it a bit, like Pizzagate, like Gamergate. These were how would you fit those sorts of events into kind of the broader culture?
Honestly, integral. I mean, I know a lot of people have written about, I guess Gamergate is still there's still people that will call themselves Gamergaters, but as a
Sure.
movement, it's not, doesn't have the same cultural heft that it used to. But
Right.
yeah, there's been lots written about like the influence of Gamergate and similar kind of movements. And sometimes that's maybe a little bit overblown, but I do think that there's a strong argument to be made that a lot of what we get with the sort of first Trump presidency and a lot of the sort of rhetoric around that can be directly traced to Gamergate, and particularly how Gamergate and similar sort of campaigns, if you want to call them that, focus predominantly on culture rather than politics directly. They frame these things as a cultural issue, and that was, I guess, to give them credit, very clever in getting people to pay attention to these things that maybe wouldn't have normally paid attention to them, specifically young people, specifically young men. So the Gamergate movement is what kind of got a lot of young men in particular passively first and then actively later involved in political issues. And a lot of them would go on to sort of help form the base of those kind of movements. And some of them are probably still active in them today. But prior to that, I mean, there were these kind of like, culture war issues that had happened,
Mm.
but Gamergate was really one that cemented the importance of mobilizing young people around cultural issues that they actually care about, and then using that as a sort of inroads into more directly political concerns, and in some cases, some pretty extreme political ideologies. So Steve Bannon, who you might remember from around the time of the first Trump presidency, he was pretty important to that campaign. And I know he only lasted a few months into the actual presidency, but as the sort of leader of Breitbart News, he was very much somebody who subscribed to the Breitbart doctrine of politics is downstream from culture. So if you want people to care about politics, you have to convince them that these are actually cultural issues, right? So for a lot, if you take the average like 14 or 15-year-old boy, they probably don't have that strong of a political identity one way or the other, right? You can't convince the average 14-year-old boy that they need to care about like the deficits or an immigration crisis. They're not going to care about that kind of stuff.
Right.
So Breitbart and other people, and Bannon, to their credit, said, well, what do young boys care about? They care about video games, they care about comic books, they care about Star Wars, whatever. So first we need to convince them that these things that they do care about are threatened and that they're under attack. And if we can convince them that that's true, then we can start shining a light on, well, who is responsible for threatening these things? Who is responsible for taking away these things that you love or that you used to love? And from that, we get the more sort of direct political orientation happening.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I had read a little while back was how like abortion, for instance, became a culture war issue back in the late 70s, and that was pushed to the front by Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and their associates, basically because they couldn't make segregation or desegregation really a talking point issue anymore. They'd lost the culture war on that, so they had to switch gears to something else.
Yeah, and yeah, we still see that happening in smaller ways. But sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but yeah. So the paper that you sent me, which I thought was really interesting, was on a genre of music called vaporwave, and how that was, or maybe largely still is, a mostly apolitical thing, but it has been co-opted in some ways by the right or the alt right or the far right, whatever, to push a far right agenda.
Yeah, that was, well, that paper came out very recently, and it's funny because it was written about a year or so ago, and it was kind of written to be like a post-mortem of like the fash wave trend, because at the time the genre was kind of dead. But then, of course, it became relevant again because just last month we had, the official Twitter accounts of, the Department of Homeland Security and ICE government-run official Twitter accounts posting fash wave content. Posted one today, like a Judge Dredd edit or whatever. But they've been posting this stuff over the last few months. So all of a sudden, this stuff has become kind of relevant again. But yeah, it started with in the kind of mid 2010s, throughout the 2010s, the sort of vaporwave, synthwave aesthetic that I don't know if it was ever like mainstream popular, but for people on the internet, it was an aesthetic and a style that I think was familiar to a lot of people, and a lot of people from the alt-right said, hey, like, this is the kind of language that young people are speaking. These are the kind of motifs and imagery and symbols and styles that they resonate with. So again, if we want to meet them somewhere, we can't just load them with our ideology right out of the gate. We got to sort of make an inroad culturally with a product that they would recognize and be familiar with. So again, it was an active campaign. So you had people like Andrew Anglin, who is this sort of, he runs the neo-Nazi Daily Stoner website. He came out right out and said it and said, hey, we need to use this music as the basically de facto genre of the alt-right, the soundtrack of the alt-right. And a lot of that had to do with what was happening with the far right more broadly at the time, which was trying to sanitize their image a little bit. Because, throughout the 80s and the 90s, you had neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, whatever, but it was very much sort of tied into the sort of skinhead aesthetic and, the combat boots and the tattoos and that sort of thing. But around the 2010s, they said, you know what, like, this isn't going to bring in a lot of new people to the movement. So, it's time to maybe put the combat boots in the closet, start wearing suits, get our haircut, present ourselves as like serious people that can be taken seriously, that will be on the news and whatever. And so it was part of a larger thing that was happening to kind of clean up, maybe not clean up the image, but at least make it more palatable to normal people.
As a similar thing, like I don't know if you're familiar with the whole evolution creationism debate, but a similar thing happened when the creationism rebranded itself as intelligent design to circumnavigate the law, basically.
Yeah, and to make it, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but to make it sound a little bit more.
Creationism in a lab coat, as we call it.
Yeah, it's less. Sure, it sounds less overtly religious if you call it intelligent design rather than young creationism or something like that. Yeah. So that story for Fashwave is kind of like a the story writ small, I guess, for these much more mainstream sort of areas that like neo-fascists are also getting into, whether it's like because it seems like they're everywhere now. There's video games, as you mentioned, or like health and fitness, right? You've got like Andrew Tate and these other lunatics who are all like, yeah, you have to get buff and eat right. And it's not just on the male side. We have like the manosphere or whatever. It seems like on the female side, or a lot of female oriented like content creators too, a lot of them also have this neo-fascist, or they're like, oh yeah, the trad wife.
The trad wives, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, in one respect, it makes sense because a lot of what kind of contemporary, and I think you covered this in your video on that, but a lot of this kind of contemporary ideology of far right extremism, or whatever you want to call it, one of the central sort of pillars of that is this idea of masculinity, and specifically like a conventional old school version of masculinity that a lot of these groups believe in our modern society is being threatened, or is being taken away, or is being vilified, or what have you. So reclaiming that sort of traditional masculinity is a big part of these movements. And that's why you get that sort of overlap between a lot of like nutrition movements, or like, MMA movements, or what have you. So on the one hand, it's like, yeah, work out, improve yourself, increase your testosterone, get buff, whatever. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing that on its own, obviously, but we do get that sort of overlap in some of these spaces where it's like, you're not doing this just for health reasons or because it makes you feel better necessarily, but you're also doing this to sort of reclaim that sort of mythic traditional masculinity that modernized, liberal, feminized society, in their view,
Mhm.
doesn't let you have anymore. And I
Right.
guess on the woman's side with like the trad wives thing, it's the same thing. It's just playing to those, old school depictions of gender, and specifically the kind of traditionally conservative view that a woman's role is to be a nurturer, to be a provider, to be a mother. So, if you want to help the movement, then if you're a woman, then you need to learn how to do those roles and prepare for a life of kind of, domestic servility, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's shocking how pervasive it is now. I mean, it really seems like it's everywhere.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, I've spoken to teachers that teach like, young kids. I'm talking like 11, 12 years old, and she's like, you'd be surprised how much of these young boys are like just loving all this Andrew Tate stuff on TikTok or whatever. And it's like, yeah, it's a little bit concerning when you have people that young that are like really deep into this kind of stuff and like using the lingo and picking up on like the mannerisms and the slogans and that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, it is very pervasive for sure.
It's
yeah,
for them. Like I'm not sure if I'm maybe mistaken in this, but I would imagine that for those young people, it's for them it seems like more like meme culture and nothing more. But of course,
Yeah,
that can be the entryway into
mhm.
actual deep hatred towards other people eventually.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
the
and
thing.
and yeah. So like when we talk about radicalization, I mean, yeah, nobody just wakes up one morning and has like extreme views about race or nationalism or whatever, right? These
Right.
are gradual things, but for a lot of young people, it does kind of start with the memes. It does kind of start with the more playful, fun aspects of it. So you know, uh, maybe you're, I don't know, like the Giga Chad types, you're like
Yeah,
memes that are playing on like ideas of masculinity and what it means to be like a Giga Chad alpha versus a beta or whatever. And, it's funny and maybe it doesn't mean that much, but, over time you can kind of internalize these ideas of like, wow, this is what, an alpha man looks like versus this is what a soy boy, cuck, beta, whatever looks like.
Mhm.
And over time, those memes or those jokes or whatever, they start to maybe become internalized and sort of lay the groundwork for a more clear political ideology to be built on top of it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if somebody comes along and says like or tries to warn them about like, aren't you like do you know that what Andrew Tate has done, and then they will use those memes against you basically as a defense mechanism. Yeah,
Yeah, it's so it can be hard to like, you're trying to, I guess, counter these things. It can be very hard to do that, especially if you're somebody who's like in a position of authority or somebody who maybe represents the sort of
I,
activities of the very system that they're kind of rebelling against in the first place.
like what's the best thing a parent could do if they found a situation where their kids are on social media and watching Andrew Tate all the time, basically. I basically, my personally, I would take away their phone, or at the very least, just prevent them from going on social media altogether until they're like 16, at the minimum. Yeah,
Yeah, it is a very
I
tricky
personally,
question.
that's how
Yeah,
I
because I
feel
mean,
personally. Yeah,
yeah, and I mean, like, on the one hand, I mean, you can only sort of hide them from these things for so long because of how pervasive they're going to be exposed to these things eventually. But yeah, I mean, it's tough to say because like parents can't necessarily monitor what their kids are doing online 24/7.
yeah,
And even if they could, I don't know if they necessarily should. But so it's tricky because like there's that level of like, as a parent, you should have some idea of what your kids are up to. But where do you draw the line as to like,
Yeah.
what's too much? Because I remember growing up on the early days of the internet, and obviously I'm a bit older, so my parents or whoever, they had no idea what was going on. So it was basically a free for all. It was the Wild West. We were on the internet doing whatever stuff we were doing with basically no supervision whatsoever.
Mm.
But nowadays, when a lot of kids are being given like tablets at like 2, 3,
go
4
go
years
Right.
tell them.
old,
Yeah,
Right.
it's a new game entirely, right?
And it certainly doesn't help that a lot of these crazy voices are being like foghorned by the largest platforms in the world. Whether it's like Joe Rogan, in the U.S., who has the largest podcasting platform. It's not just him. The right wing. We did a video a little while back titled "Asymmetric Propaganda," and one of the things that we talked about was how massive and well in tune with each other the right wing is. So the right wing um and there's another study that came out that I thought was a little funny that showed that like there's a greater diversity of opinions on the right, and
Mhm.
I think that might be true only because like you can have vastly different like conspiracies on the right wing the way that you don't typically have like or center or left, the uh but the there is for a lot of these groups this sort of like to an extent there is an ideological conformity, right? And so they're all or a lot of them are pushing directly or indirectly these very far right groups.
Yeah, and I mean, like the far right online media ecosystem. I mean, as you say, it's so much better funded. It's so much better run, I suppose. It's just much more accessible. The numbers that they poll are, so much larger than anything
Yeah.
that like liberal or left wing media can kind of offer in response. So, um, whether that's by design or whether that's like an accurate reflection of um, people's wants. I mean, I assume it's more the former rather than the later, but um, yeah, I mean, it's hard to compete. And I know there's been lots of people saying like, well, where's like the Joe Rogan of the left or whatever?
Hmm.
Why is there not a platform that is comparable to these other platforms? I know there's, there must be an audience out there. There must be people out there that want this, but they just haven't been able to sort of uh, reach those same numbers. And whether that's due to their own incompetence or whether that's due to the fact that they're just not as well
Mm.
propped up, as you say, by the platforms themselves, or they don't have the same amount of money behind them. That's probably a big part of it, I think, as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's probably a multitude of factors all coming together. So we've been kind of well, I guess we've already kind of started touching on this. Is like how do people become radicalized? Like, what are ways that people start taking on extremist beliefs? And in some ways, as we've already kind of talked about, like maybe it's just in the background, and it's something you kind of pick up just through, by accident, by happenstance as a kid. But what are sort of the primary ways that people tend to start acquiring like politically extreme beliefs?
Yeah, well, anybody in this field will tell you that, every single individual's radicalization trajectory is going to be at the end of the day very highly unique. It's going
Mm,
to be very highly dependent on that individual's yes, the culture that they grow up in, but also highly dependent on their individual experiences or individual
sure.
grievances, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about like a radicalization profile or what the process looks like, it's kind of hard to speak in like generalities, but I'll do it anyway. Um, but just with that caveat that like everybody's experience is always going to be a little bit different
Sure.
and based on other things. But yeah, I would say if we're talking about this specific version that we've been discussing today, so like contemporary sort of online driven far right kind of stuff in particular, yeah, I think a lot of it does start with people getting into it young. And again, not necessarily interested in the overtly political messaging, but making those cultural inroads. Or, I mean, there is an argument to be made for at least from like my generation and maybe people a little bit younger than me around this idea of desensitization and that sort of thing. Like, there's a lot of
Mm,
people in like the early days of like 4chan or whatever where they were going on there and they were sharing like their Hitler jokes and their Hitler memes and their racist whatever, not necessarily because they had like a deep belief in any of that stuff, It was mostly just like, hey, like, I want to say the most offensive thing that I can because that's what we're doing. That's the whole point, right? You know, I wasn't sharing these because I was like a firm believer in the ideology, or even if I said that I was, it was
Just being edgy.
Yeah, just being edgy, just to get a rise out of people. But, you know, over time, those things can sort of internalize themselves in people, right? And if you become desensitized, or, you know, to use the term that people were using a while ago, like irony poisoned to a lot of this stuff, and it makes it maybe easier to subscribe to some of these ideologies. But I think for sure, like, cultural products are a big one. That's why Gamergate was as massive as it was, right? So you're going to like a young boy and saying like, hey, haven't you noticed that, you know, the games that you're playing lately, or the movies that you've been watching lately, or the TV shows that you've been watching lately, or whatever it is, haven't you noticed that they're kind of lame now? And haven't you ever thought about why they're kind of lame now? And let me tell you why. It's because, you know, this group, that group, whether
It's
it's,
the
you know,
immigrants, the
the
brown
immigrants
people.
or the
Yeah,
liberals or the feminists or whoever it is,
right.
but they are, you know, they're diluting this once great product so that they can't be what it used to be. And you know,
Yeah,
that
like
resonates with a
almost
lot of people.
finding or instilling a grievance almost.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like, you know, you went to the latest whatever, you went to the newest Star Wars movie and you didn't like it. Well, let me tell you why you didn't like it. It's because, you know, they're trying to force like whatever, a female protagonist
Right.
down your throat, or they're trying to force all of these, you know, diversity or whatever it is. And let me tell you why they're doing this, because, you know, the whole Hollywood media establishment is actually run by these liberals or run by these whoever. So, you know, if you want to fight back against this and make movies or games great again, you have to go backwards. And that sense of kind of nostalgia is a really big driver for a lot of these movements. But, you know, psychologically, it doesn't actually track. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, they say like whatever music you listen to as like a teenager or young adult, that's what's going to be imprinted upon you for basically the rest of your life. You know, it's not a coincidence that when you ask most people who are in like their 20s or 30s or older, like, what was your favorite movie, or what's your favorite TV shows, or what's your favorite video games, they're probably going to mention things that they experienced when they were young. And it's not necessarily because those games or movies or products were necessarily better, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that, well, I experienced whatever this video game when I was 13, and I remember playing it during my summer vacation from school and hanging out with my friends, and back when life was good and I didn't have to worry about bills or responsibilities or anything else. So it's not necessarily the game that they miss. It's that sense of, you know,
The
before
childish
life.
naivete.
Yeah, exactly. Before life started sort of kicking them in the face. That's what they really miss. But they've been convinced that no, actually, you know, the products themselves are being tainted. So, but yeah, all that to say is that a lot of these movements rely very heavily on that concept of nostalgia and that sense of, hey, don't you think life was better back then? And shouldn't we go back to the conditions from back then and put the foot on the brake of heading toward all this new modern stuff that we don't like?
Oh, I have a
Absolutely.
question, but unless Jackson has something
Oh
else.
no, go ahead, Nestle.
All right. It's a bit of a complicated question. I have to explain something before. The way I imagine, I imagine two types of extremism. Of maybe it's too oversimplified, but just to humor me for a second, I imagine extremism can come from the bottom up, where you see like a grassroots movement almost, and most often these appear to come from like. A demographic that's being oppressed. A good example would be the IRA in Ireland, right? When the Irish were oppressed by the British, and you see extremists appearing from there. But you can also have something like a state imposing propaganda onto the people from the top, basically. Are there commonality, or are these two very distinctive types of extremism, or am I maybe in the wrong here?
No, I think you're onto something there for sure. And I mean, it used to be in like the, I guess, pre-internet days, that extremism, it typically was very much these kind of grassroots, bottom-up things, and it often was, you know, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with these various groups, but it often was framed upon legitimate grievances. Whether it was
Yes.
like, you know, the
Right.
Irish in North Ireland, or whether it was like the Kurds in Kurdistan, or even groups like, you know, the Mujahideen, which eventually became like Al Qaeda.
Right.
I mean, Afghanistan was invaded; they were fighting back against an invading force. So like, there's there's legitimate reasons why these groups come together and fight back against whoever they see as their enemy. And in those days, radicalization and somebody that would join those groups, it almost had to happen offline and through these kind of, IRL social connections. The difference today is that that's not necessarily true anymore. A lot of the people that belong to these movements, and even a lot of the people that have gone that extra step further and committed acts of violence in the real world, a lot of these people have maybe never physically met with any of these other people in these spaces, but their communications are happening online and virtually and that sort of thing. So that idea of like online self-radicalization that a lot of people have been afraid of over the last 10 or so years is certainly a troubling thing to think about. And when you consider it as something that is potentially from the top down, I think that plays too, because when you look at how a lot of these people are being introduced to these spaces, and when you're looking at the main actors within these spaces, yeah, there's evidence to suggest that these are some cases organized and well-funded kind of networks and movements that are orchestrating these kinds of messaging in the first place.
That was something that we kind of hit
go
on
ahead.
in the neo-fascism video, is like trying not to detract from the sort of underlying or at the very base these grievances that people have, right? Because like you don't want to just necessarily like be like, oh well, you're just worried about nothing or whatever, but like showing that, okay, there's kind of a kernel of truth to what they're saying about this. For instance, one of the things we talked about was in the case of Yugoslavia falling into like the Balkan Wars. One of the causes for that was the hollowing out of uh, the economic system, the way that the country was built by neoliberal policies, which were imposed by the International Monetary Fund. And I wonder, because kind of tying back to the first part of your answer, Nestlig, was um, these like the kernel of truth to their grievance, and part of the reason, like one of the major things that these groups often have nostalgia for is like the 50s, right? They want to live in like a 1950s America again, which of course was built on the social democratic programs of FDR, right? The all the safety net and everything that was built by these democratic programs that made living in the 50s and 60s in the US such a good time.
Yeah,
And then all these programs have been
remind them that the corporate tax rate at that time was something like 90% or whatever it is, right? So
right. And so neoliberal policies starting like late 70s have basically been just destroying that gradually over time.
yeah, but I mean, it is true that like we shouldn't, regardless of which of these groups or movements, like we shouldn't discount the grievances that they're bringing up, because as you say, like a lot of times there is legitimate concerns for these things. And I mean, going back to Trump's first 2016 victory, I mean, I guess to his credit, he was one of the few, if not the only one, that was actually willing to acknowledge the grievances. Now, the way in which he sort of described them and the solutions that he provided for them, that's, in my view, way off the mark. But he was one of the few people to say, hey, yeah, you feel like your life sucks lately? It does. And I'm the one that's actually going to do something about it. Other Republican nominees and the Democratic nominees, they're going to say, well, it's not that bad. We'll just basically move forward as usual. But Trump was the one that basically said, you feel powerless, you feel disempowered or impoverished, or you feel as if, your dollar isn't going as far or whatever. Yeah, you're right. It does suck right now. So that was powerful for a lot of people to hear that and have their kind of grievances, even if it was superficial, even if you didn't really mean it,
right?
Just to have their grievances even acknowledged, I think is what attracted a lot of people to him in the first place. So, I mean, for a lot of the people that get swept up into these things, I mean, they're looking at their lives and they're saying that, yeah, you know what? Inflation is high. I'm never going to be able to own a home. I'm going to be in debt forever. my future prospects economically or socially or professionally don't look super great. So it makes sense, going back to what we were saying about nostalgia, but it makes sense as to why, people are not necessarily looking forward to like a brighter future, but they're looking backwards to a point where maybe things, were more economically or culturally or whatever, better for them. So um, I was reading a study that from the Lancet that just came out that said something like 55% of young people, and I think it was like 17 to 25, but 55% of them believe that basically the world is doomed because of climate change, economic. So when you have over half of the young people thinking that like the future is not even going to be a future,
Right.
it makes sense why people sort of maybe give in to that sort of nihilistic despair, and why some people way of coping with that is by maybe joining or getting swept up into one of these movements that even if it's fake or even if it's not real, at least on the surface provides a solution and says, hey, here's something you can do about it, here's something you can do to fight back against it.
I'm sorry, Nestle, I cut you off. Say what you were gonna say.
I was just there's also something we would talk about before about like the difference between bottom up extremism and top down extremism. And I was just about to bring up an example of top down extremism that I remember. I think it happened in Texas in the middle of the 20th century, where like you had these unions appearing, popping up against like big corporations, and one of the ways that they busted those unions was basically promoting racism. So you have the preventing black people from forming unions with white people, basically. Can you maybe comment on that example, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's we still see similar things happening today. I think whenever the economic powers, the elites, the corporate interest, whatever you want to call it, whenever they start to feel threatened, and what makes them feel threatened is people, workers coming together. Whenever they feel threatened by that, they will try to do whatever they can to sow disharmony between the workers, between the people. And, the workers, the people, they typically have a lot more in common with each other than they do with like, these corporate interests or the bosses or the owners or whoever, right? So how do we convince these people that they're actually enemies, and how do we get them infighting? Well, that's where we bring in these cultural issues, whether it was race in the middle of the 20th century, as you point out, or today issues like LGBT rights or abortion, or other cultural issues that we can use to sort of get people fighting and say that, hey, here's a thing that you can fight over while keeping you distracted from the fact that the billionaires are robbing you blind and everything else, right? So yeah, it's a tactic that been using for a very, very long time, and one that makes sense because it actually seems to work. I think the last time that like corporate interest was legitimately threatened, at least in America, was during the Occupy Wall Street movement. Where you had people coming together, and you actually made it seem like, yeah, the people, right, left, liberal, conservative, but the people were largely united on tackling that type of like corporate greed and corporate malfeasance. And they got a bit scared by that, so they said, you know what, we're going to drive a wedge between people again. We need to get these people fighting over these cultural issues that, I'm not saying they don't matter, they do affect people, but we'll at least keep them distracted from shining their light on us, right?
And that's how you get Fox News.
Exactly, yeah. And
Yeah.
in Fox News convincing that like poor people, whether they're poor black people, poor white people, whatever, but that poor people are each other's enemies, and that they should never sort of unite on any issues that actually they do have in common and actually do affect them all.
I mean, I love the Lyndon B. Johnson quote that if you convince the lowest white man that he's higher than the highest black man, he won't notice when you're picking his pocket.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah. So so now we've been talking about how people start becoming radicalized. They build on grievances, on perhaps to some extent perceived, but to some extent real grievances, and these start building them towards an extreme political behavior. So how do they go from just having these beliefs in their head to outright performing radicalized acts?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's worth saying that that is still a very small minority of people that actually do cross that line. So there's probably a lot of extremists out there, or people that we might label or define as extremists, but the amount of them that actually cross that last threshold into committing real world violence is still pretty small. But it is still worth considering, because you always want to make sure that you can prevent these things if possible. But what we've seen lately is, for a lot of young people, and especially in this kind of new, I guess, genre of violence that we've seen over the last maybe 5-10 years, of kind of young lone wolf single actor type violence, whether it's mass shooting stuff or targeted whatever. But for a lot of young people, this is, or at least they're told that this is kind of their way to cement a certain legacy, that's in a world that is meaningless, or in a world that has no sort of future, or where identity is kind of impossible to sort of um, create. This is your way to actually be somebody. This is your way to actually affect a change. This is your way to have a Wikipedia page made about you that will live forever. So for a lot of young people that maybe don't have any prospects, that is potentially an attractive outcome, to be like, hey, like, I do this and I will live forever, or at least my life will have some meaning. Now, whether they're doing that out of like a blind kind of nihilism, or whether they're doing that to further a political goal, we've seen both cases, right? I mean, we had the case here in Canada with the Quebec mosque shooter. You can look at the New Zealand Christchurch shooter. You can look at the El Paso shooter in America from a few years ago. These people, and we can take it directly from them, because a lot of them did police interviews or wrote manifestos, and they said, yes, what I did, this act of violence, it was, in their view, an act of self-defense, or an act of defense for their people, who they believed were being threatened by the immigrants or the invading forces or whoever it is. But for them, it's a proactive act of defense. So if I do this, I believe that I can affect, even if it's on a small scale, some kind of legitimate change that I truly believe in. But it does seem that in the last few years, more and more of these acts of violence are what we might call ideologically confused,
Okay.
where if you read their manifestos, for those that leave them, or if we follow like their online profiles, for instance, or their online activities, it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's kind of all over the place. It's like
Mhm.
it's a weird combination of political ideologies, some from the far right, some from other sources, and it's not nearly as cohesive as it used to be. And I think that's
Mm.
largely the result of just kind of how the modern internet operates, and how kind of algorithms send everybody off onto their own highly individualized islands. But still, at
Mm.
the end of the
It's almost
day,
like a manifesto written by AI.
it
Yeah.
almost seems like they're just throwing, yeah, they're just kind of like throwing all these weird slogans and words and phrases into a machine, and then it's just churning out like some kind of
Hmm.
output. And some of them, I think, are doing that on purpose, because I think for some of them, part of the fun is like watching the media respond to these things.
Mm.
So if I'm going to go out and do an act of violence, and regardless of the reasons, maybe I'm doing it because I believe in a cause, maybe I'm just doing it because I'm nihilistic and I'm depressed and suicidal, and I just want to leave a mark before I go, or whatever. But hey, I'm going to write this manifesto, and I'm going to say that Sonic the Hedgehog radicalized me, and whatever. I'm just going to say like the weirdest stuff.
Right.
And part of the fun is just watching the media, and people in the media like pick that apart, and trying to
Mm.
like subscribe, like, is this a right-wing thing, is this a left-wing thing, like what does this mean? And it just
Mm.
kind of adds to that confusion, and for a lot of them, that's part of the game, I think.
Interesting. Okay, I hadn't really thought about it that way. I have I was watching a video the other day by a this YouTuber here in the U.S. called FD Signifier, who does
Yep.
he did a video recently on it was like the Charlie Kirk shooting, or that was like one aspect of it, but it kind of placed it in the broader context of other like random acts of violence. And one of the things he talked about was like how there's typically rules now for the media where you're not supposed to talk about these people, like show their faces or whatever, because that kind of incentivizes, copycats to be
Mm.
like, oh yeah, if they got famous doing that, then I can do this too.
Yeah, I think, and not all media follows that, but I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's generally good advice. I mean, if you can deny them that outcome that they're hoping for, then that's, um, I think like it's also getting harder because of how, and this is kind of like one of the more tragic things, but how fast the news cycles tend to move
Hmm.
in kind of 2020s.
Right.
So if you might be too young to remember like something like Columbine when it happened,
Yeah.
but when that happened, I mean that news cycle dominated for like the entire year. Like every
Mm.
single night, it was Columbine, Columbine, Columbine for at least a year, and there's documentaries made about it and everything. But like as the news cycle goes faster and faster, it seems like the amount of time that they spend on a mass shooting or an act of violence gets shorter and shorter to a point where it's like, you know, you talk about these things for, I don't know, maybe a week or something, and then you kind of
Yeah,
move
you're
on.
you're
Like,
living in a blur almost. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the
yeah,
case of Charlie Kirk, for instance, who that was a very big, event in terms of like the coverage it got. Right, I've never seen that degree of coverage for any school shooting. Certainly, I mean, Uvalde kind of approached it, but like even then wasn't the same. But like for a couple of weeks, it was literally my entire feed
yeah.
on Twitter was just him. A bunch of videos, came out about him and everything. But it's already like if you
Yeah,
look at
it is weird because that was like only a few months ago when that happened, and it already feels like that's ancient history now, right? And
yeah,
even like the Trump assassination attempt from
hmm
a while, like if that would have happened in the 90s or the 80s, like we'd probably still be talking about it. But like it's just like that seems like something that was forever ago. So I don't think that's necessarily intentional. I think a lot of that is just like how the internet and
sure,
how modern media works these
sure,
days, and you know, for better or for worse. But
Yeah.
um,
Like I'm now looking at the Google Trends, and I looked up Charlie Kirk's name, and I see it's mostly flat, and then it's packed up on September the 7th, and then within a month it's flat again.
yeah,
It's
yeah, so that's
really,
just very, very wild how it
yeah,
holds.
so
So
fast.
yeah, if you are
um,
one of these people that's trying to make a name for yourself by doing that kind of thing, I don't know if the current media climate even allows for that anymore, because maybe you'll
mm,
be on everybody's feed for like a day or two, but that's pretty much it, right?
yeah. The actual people who commit the acts are basically just like zoomed out of the picture, whereas like the act itself or the survivors of it. I mean, because you have people like I forget his first name. Is it David Hogg? I think.
Oh, from the Marjorie, from the
The
Marjorie
Yeah, he
Stone.
survived like a school
he
shooting
Yeah,
when he
survived
was
yeah,
in
the
high school.
He's a Sandy Hook survivor, right?
I
I don't
think
think he was.
was
No, I don't think he was Sandy Hook. He was from the Marjorie
Oh,
Stoneman Douglas shooting.
oh yeah, right.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Different
Yeah,
one. Yeah.
But yeah, so he and his classmates, the ones who survived, like became very, outspoken people against about gun laws and stuff. But
right.
like, no one remembers the name of the person who like did the shooting, right? But we remember the survivors and because they've become much more prominent later on. But I think that again goes to your point is yeah, is like um, they just get fed into the news cycle and then they're gone shortly thereafter. Uh, the When we did a video recently called "Downplaying Extremism," where we talk about a we talked about an incident that occurred last year, or it's kind of half and half. It's an event that occurred last year, and then the second half of it is the Young Republican group chat that came out this year, where they're all members of the Hitler Youth. But the event that occurred last year was there was a there have been a series of terrorists associated with this group called the Society of Saint Pius X, and the FBI wrote like an internal memo that was like, how can we reach out to this group to try to set up like tripwires to prevent more terrorist activities, and Republican lawmakers took that memo and said, look, the FBI is investigating Catholic churches,
Mm.
despite the fact that the the people they were looking into were domestic terrorists. So what do you make of that?
That's well, it comes back to something that we see a lot in the field of like terrorism and extremism studies, and that is the definition of these things being incredibly politically weighted.
Mm,
So, how do you define terrorism? How do you define extremism? Good luck getting anybody to agree on what those definitions actually mean, especially if we're talking about government or law
Yeah.
enforcement or what have you. So, it doesn't surprise me that that's the case. It's very much so. For example, like I got some American colleagues that work in this field, and especially since Trump came back into office, they've said that like a lot of the funding for a lot of the research that they've done has been gutted. Like it's just completely
mhm.
dried up because the government doesn't want to fund research into like far right terrorism
Yeah,
anymore, right?
yeah.
So like you can draw your own implications as to why that's the case, but so it's a political decision at the end of the day where it's like we're not going to fund this anymore. So a lot of their sort of stuff that would have funded the research has now dried up. But we see that kind of trend happening every kind of generation or so, where it's like, how do we define these things? So in Canada, for instance, for a very long time, if you look at the Canadian government's list of designated terrorist organizations, and there's a bunch of groups on there,
Mm,
for a long time, about 95% of that list was like jihadist, Islamist extremist
right.
style groups. It wasn't until like very recently that they actually started adding groups like the Proud Boys or the Base or other more like
Mm,
explicitly white nationalist or far right groups, and even that was kind of contentious. And if you go back to like Twitter circa like 2016, 2017 ish, when ISIS was actually using the Twitter platform quite prominently and quite
mm,
effectively. They had thousands of like ISIS affiliated Twitter accounts kind of spreading propaganda and stuff. Eventually Twitter cracked down and they said, you know what, we're going to stamp out ISIS on our platform entirely. And they did it very effectively. And it's funny because nobody complained about that because, well, right wing, left wing, conservative, liberal, pretty much everyone agrees that ISIS is bad and we should get
right.
rid of ISIS, right? But now if well, I guess it's different now under Musk, but if Twitter would say, hey, we're going to stomp out, or we're going to try and stamp out far right extremism on the platform, then all of a sudden there's going to be much more kind of uproar and much more
Mm,
pushback to that, right? And then this idea of like, well, what do you mean by extremism? Or just because you're conservative that makes you a terrorist? Is that what you're saying? So
right.
the definitions become very muddled, and especially when you don't have a universal agreed upon definition of what is an extremist or what is a terrorist, and especially when like the media plays such a big role in shaping people's understandings of those definitions in the first place. So if Trump goes on Fox News and says, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, or
Hmm.
Antifa is a terrorist organization, or whatever, that might not mean anything legally, but it does carry a lot of like cultural weight into
Sure.
how people view these things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, the anti-fascist, not a, I mean, is a movement, I guess you might say. 'Cause it's not a group. Being designated a terrorist organization is certainly wild. I have to admit that I unfortunately fell prey to the propaganda around Black Lives Matter, for instance, um, because I um, remember when all that was going on. That was like what 20 was it 2017, 2016, 2017,
And then, yeah.
um, something like that. And so the was it maybe even a little bit later, but at any rate, the when that was happening, I remember all of the coverage I ever saw of it was like, this is violent protest or whatever. But then I saw a retrospective study that actually statistically analyzed all of the BLM protests and the actual number, the percent of protests that actually involved violence or graffiti or vandalism of any sort was like 7%.
Yeah, but of course those are the ones that the media is going to highlight and shine a light on, and make the case that that is emblematic of the entire sort of the entire movement or whatever. So Yeah, I mean, it makes sense why people would believe that if that's where they're getting all the news from, and the media is saying that, you know, they're doing this and this is bad and this is terrorism, therefore this is a terrorist organization or a terrorist movement or what have you. I mean, I don't agree with that, but it makes sense. It makes sense as to why people
Where I would have that
might
perception.
accept that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was upset with myself, you know, for having been propagandized.
We learn and we grow.
Right, that's the hope. Um, yeah, yeah, reading about the we did a different video recently titled "A Critique of Both Sidesism," which is mostly about the we read a paper by John T. Jost where he goes through just all these different metrics about like the left versus the right in terms of like which group is more likely to engage in like anti-democratic behavior, which one is more likely to engage in like actual acts of like terrorism and all this other stuff. And we did a whole video where we go through all that, and the paper is really good. And one of the things that, and that was when I came across for the first time that study that I see more and more now because it's Laura Loomer and the other Looney Tunes in the administration are like, this is, we've never seen leftist violence like this before, and they show the chart, and it's like the point that's leftist violence, the point that's, you know, right violence,
Yeah.
and but that was the first time I've ever seen that chart.
Yeah, and yeah, in terrorism studies, we've kind of known that for a while, that the overwhelming majority, at least within the last 10, 15 years or so, overwhelming majority of the actual violence is much more weighted to the far right as opposed to any like far left equivalent. But I suspect, even though that's statistically true and there is a big statistical difference, I suspect if you were to ask like a lot of average people, they probably wouldn't think that that's the case, right? They might think that it's either closer to 50-50 or, you know, depending on their political orientation. I assume a lot of people would say, well, no, actually, it's all these left-wing crazy
Right.
thugs that are out there doing everything,
Antifa,
right?
BLM, those are all,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it just shows you kind of how important the media is in shaping people's perceptions and understandings of these things, and then how those perceptions and understandings can then actually inform public policy or inform like who people vote for, or, you know, whatever else.
Well, I also think it's not just the media, because I also I very often see like just a complete refusal to acknowledge the bad side of your own side. Like for like a good example is like I often see people like criticizing the extremism of, for example, Islam, like how they treat women, for example. But then you have people like Andrew Tate, uh, and Matt Gates and
Yeah.
Donald Trump, who brags about grabbing women by their genitals, and when you
And
point
is a
that out,
convicted rapist now, you know.
yeah, and, and,
So,
when, and when you point those things out, they will say like, oh, it's just locker room talk. Like they will just completely dismiss or completely excuse that type of behavior. So I think it's just, yeah, it's how would you address such a thing?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately, especially these days, with again with like how sort of everyone's brains are kind of ruined by algorithms and the internet. It's kind of an unfortunate reality that, yes, I mean, it's on the one hand easier than it's ever been to justify your own political point of view by finding stuff that's going to align with that and by ignoring everything that's going to potentially challenge that or call out the hypocrisies in that. um, it's just, and it's something that we see in the wake of these events. I mean, so if we think back, to instance, to the Charlie Kirk event, immediately people were on the internet being like, all right, was it, who did the shooting? Was it one of my guys, or was it, you know, one of the other guys? Or how can we frame this and make it seem as if, you know, this guy was, you know, a liberal or on the left or
right.
whatever. So a lot of people were like, you know, people would desperately climb onto things and say, well, you know, a lot of people, you know, were saying that, you know, maybe he's a Groyper disenfranchised MAGA guy, whereas other people are saying, no, obviously he's like Antifa, college, trans-brained, liberal, leftist, lunatic, whatever. Anything that's going to, you know, justify my worldview while making it seem as if this is the other side that's doing it. And, you know, even if stuff comes out later, even if facts come out later, a lot of people's ideas and opinions are already sort of solidified and already made up. So at that point, it doesn't really matter, right? So It's very easy to go on the internet and find examples of like this group or this movement that I don't like doing a bad thing, and then using that to sort of be emblematic of the entire group, while at the same time it's very easy to just scroll past or ignore the bad stuff that your own side is doing. So social media companies, they know this, they feed on this kind of antagonism. That's what drives a lot of their traffic, that's what drives a lot of engagement. So um, probably some natural human psychology going on there, but it's dialed up to 11 and exacerbated by these social media companies that thrive on that kind of conflict, because that's what generates engagement and that's what generates revenue at the end of the day. So it is it is kind of think about it that way. That's, I think, the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I I think you're totally right. Everything's a lot of websites are monetized by like other engagement, right? And it's not just the social media, unfortunately. Also, like a lot of newspapers now are monetized entirely by engagement,
Mm.
and so it's I think that's in part how has driven. There's a political economy of just putting out nonstop like blog posts and stuff like that, because that's how you drive. And of course you have to say more and more offensive or exaggerated things, because that's how you bring more people to your site. That's how you get them to click again and again on the articles. So kind of taking all of that together, um, how do we de-radicalize people? Is it possible to
Oh,
de-radicalize people? Where do we
that was
go
also my
from?
question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great, that's the $1 million question. And I so do wish I could give like a succinct, direct answer to that, but I can't, unfortunately. I can talk about that and talk about what we have done and what we have seen, but being in this field for a while, and anyone else in this field will probably tell you the same thing, that is de-radicalization possible? Sure, it's possible. We've seen examples of it. We've seen people that have been on the extreme
Do, do
fringes,
we
on
see
the brink.
do we see commonalities with those people who have been de-radicalized?
Well, maybe, but it's similar to the radicalization process itself. The de-radicalization process is also very, very highly individualized. It's very highly subjective and based on what's happening in
Mhm.
their life. So, for example, there was a person here in Canada, and he was a member of a neo-Nazi gang. He had been in this neo-Nazi gang for about 7 or 8 years, so a long time. He had risen high up in the leadership, so he was like deep in it, really deep in it. And I know him now. He's out of that life, and when he tells his story, he talks about like the thing that brought him back, and it was having a baby daughter. So he had a little daughter, and he remembers the way he describes it. He remembers looking in her eyes one day, and just thinking to himself like, this little baby daughter who is like so pure and like doesn't know anything about hate or sin or whatever. I'm supposed to teach her that she's supposed to hate these people, and for some reason that like flipped a switch in his head
Mm.
that caused him to start questioning his entire like worldview and ideology. And that was, amongst other things, but that was like really the catalyst that started getting him out of that. So
Mm.
I'm not saying the solution is to like have a baby, but like it's just an example of how like
Sure.
individual experiences can really shape somebody's trajectory. So yes, there's been examples. Maybe it's, for some people, it's they say that they've been going deep into these rabbit holes, they've been into these communities or believing these things, and maybe they come across, like, I don't know, a content creator on YouTube or something who's maybe pointing out the hypocrisies in this worldview or whatever, and that's the thing that started asking them the questions to get them out or whatever. So definitely is possible, but is there a way to like uniformly create like a de-radicalization program or policy that's going to be 100% effective on everybody across the board?
Hmm.
Probably not.
I mean,
So
obviously, they just have to watch our content. That's all they have to do.
yeah, there you
And
go.
it
That'll
pulls
help.
them right
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. But I mean, like, YouTube is a
Oh,
big one. I think there's a lot of people that point to YouTube and content creators on YouTube, and they say like, I watched this video that like pointed out the hypocrisies or the flaws in this ideology, and I watched a few more videos, and that got me seeing things in like a different way. So just as YouTube has been responsible for radicalizing a lot of young people. I think it's also can be something that can de-radicalize them. But yeah, but if you're the government and you're trying to like, how do we fix radicalization? I don't know if there's like a one size universal answer to that question necessarily. It's a highly individualized phenomenon either way.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a paper I read, I think it was on the quest for personal significance, I think. Maybe or maybe not. But it was one of the, or no, sorry, it was the staircase to terrorism. That's what it was. But basically one of the models for how like people move from just having radical beliefs to becoming more and more comfortable with like doing radical acts. And that paper talked about how like, okay, you could potentially get people off the ramp at these certain stages, but kind of once they pass like a certain threshold, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of
Yeah,
get them on the
yeah,
off ramp.
and I know that paper. It was a pretty like foundational paper in terrorism studies, and yeah, I mean, is it highly difficult when somebody is at like the fringes when like they're literally ready to go out and like build a bomb or whatever? Is it much more difficult to walk them back from that? Sure, but my like last shred of optimism peeking through. But you got to believe that it can still be possible. I think you got to believe that you can affect that kind of change. Now, how you do it is a much more difficult question to ask, but I do think that we should continue searching for that answer because I think there's value in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing like I said, we've on this channel for a long time, we've done like debates with creationists because, I feel like if someone gets into creationism, it's theoretically possible to pull them out, right? I guess and for some people, um, very, very few people, we've managed to pull them out directly by having a conversation with them. Although for a lot of people, it's like, I'll get an email, you know, every so often that says like, "Hey, thanks for the videos. Really appreciate, helped fill in the holes in my knowledge, and now you know, I don't think creationism is plausible anymore, or whatever." Um, but yeah, and that's also why we've started doing these other videos, these more political ones, to try to get at why uh, these philosophies are so prevalent in our society. Maybe try to
Yeah,
help.
yeah, and I mean, like those are different topics, but at the same time, like a lot of the mindset is very similar. When we talk about like people that have extremist beliefs, I mean, as with a lot of people that have maybe it's religious beliefs or just beliefs about whatever who their favorite basketball player is, whatever. People that have very strong beliefs, we see sort of consistent patterns in their thinking and how they approach these things, right? And often it is like, yes, a very sort of dichotomy, black and white way of viewing this issue. There's the right and the wrong. There's the good and the bad, whatever. And if you've belonged to that one side for the most of your life, it's very hard to like come out from that and actually start asking questions in a critical way. Like everybody's going to tell you that they're open to critical thought and that they think critically and they're open to new ideas. Everybody's going to say that, but the amount of people that are actively able to practice that, I think, is much more rare.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess sort of in closing, are there any points that you want to make or
Um,
works you want to hawk
well,
or
I
anything?
have one
Or
more. I have
oh,
one
go
more
ahead, Nissan.
comment or question, but unless you say like we need to cut it
No, go ahead.
out, then I'm fine. All right, and like one of my big things is that like for example, we talked a bit about the so-called manosphere, where you have like many young men, especially feel have a grievance about of the feeling of being demasculated in the modern era. But I would also I would think that the main issue is like that they will often put the blame on like women or feminism specifically, but I would point out that the problem is actually the very uh, imposition of the toxic masculinity itself that has been imposed on them. Like it's almost like the manosphere gives them a poison, and then they feel worse, and then they will say, "Oh, I will give you more poison," and it's almost like an abusive relationship, basically. It's difficult to get out of such a thing. So my main thing is like, how would you? Like I said again, it comes back to the same question. Like, how would you give them a better message to get out of something like that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the kind of irony with with the manosphere in particular, but with a lot of these groups, right? Is that like
it's also not the manosphere itself, because it's also like even in Hollywood, basically you have the uh, the the stereotypical male figure that is often promoted. Like if you see how actors like Hugh Jackson, or how the actor
Hugh
of
Jackman.
Wolverine, how
Yeah.
Hugh Jackman, like if you see the insane stuff he does to prepare for his role, like he dehydrates himself to look like that, it's insane. Yeah.
But to hold yourself to the standards of like a Hollywood actor that can afford, a personal chef to prepare every meal, and a personal trainer and a nutritionist,
Right.
and it's obviously not realistic. But yeah, you're right. Like those are the standards that, and you can argue that this has maybe gotten better than it used to be, but still, those are largely the standards that are imposed on people through media and through culture. So it makes sense why like a lot of young men in particular get swept up into this and say like, how do I, and for a lot of them, like, again, there is a kernel of legitimate grievance there. If it's like, if I'm a 14-year-old boy and maybe I don't feel very charming, or maybe I haven't had a lot of luck with girls or whatever, maybe I've tried but I've been rejected. Rejection sucks. I understand that. I empathize with that. So maybe they're looking to like go on the internet and find tips, and maybe it starts off like innocuous, like, how do I talk to girls? How do I, whatever, they're just generally trying to like make themselves more appealing, whatever. But usually that's going to end up sort of getting them into this, getting their first steps into that kind of manosphere world of, here's how you become like, whatever, the alpha that all women want, and then all the other sort of political baggage that goes along with that. But I would say that if you want to sort of help people focus on things, it comes back to something we were discussing earlier, about grievances and about how, a lot of times corporate interest tries to divide people. There are a lot of problems happening right now in the West more broadly, and in America specifically, not to throw stones across the border at America, but yeah, I mean, economically things are rough. A lot of young people are struggling. A lot of young people are facing the pressure, but I think the solution there is to start convincing them that it's not because of, the immigrants, or it's not because of political threats or whatever else that these problems exist.
Yeah.
It's much more direct. It's corporate greed. It's everything else that's.
And we need a better message to dispel the distractions, basically. Like I think one good recent example would be Mamdani, who ran on a very popular or populist message, but from a left wing side instead of the right wing side. Yeah, and he was very successful with that.
Yeah, he was successful, on the one hand, because he's like charismatic and a good speaker, but he articulates these things very simply. He says, hey, like, rent is too high, we're gonna freeze rent, or people, we're gonna give you things that speak directly to your material self-interest, whether it's whatever, freezing the rent or free buses or whatever. But he presents that very, very simply in ways that resonate with working class people across the political spectrum, right? So I think you're absolutely right. Like that kind of messaging, that very simplified messaging that speaks to people's economic interests, but at the same time is going to channel their valid frustrations toward the people that actually deserve it, rather than these kind of constructed outgroups that a lot of these movements create.
We have a question from the audience. Zach Lee Wright asks, or says, I have a black coworker who is a reactionary, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, but otherwise we get along. What do I do? He believes the opposite of anything that the government or institutions or scientists say.
It reminds
And thank
me
you
though,
for the $20, Zach Lee.
a couple of years ago, there was, maybe it wasn't even that long ago, but there was a shooter who I believe was a black guy and was also like deep into like the anti-Semitism, white supremacy type stuff. So again, it comes back to this idea of like people's personal and political identities being very fractured today and being like very kind of all over the place.
Mm.
So I mean, if you have a friend who's like down these kind of conspiratorial rabbit holes and is perhaps rightfully maybe a little bit mistrustful of what the government has to say, I would say, you know, try to maybe introduce them to resources that are maybe
Yeah.
you can be critical of the government, and I think there's lots of reasons to be
Sure, absolutely.
critical of the
Right.
government. So maybe try introducing them to sources that say, hey, like you're right, maybe the government is maybe a little bit sus, but maybe not in the ways that you thought, maybe in other ways. So, you know, if you can kind of meet them halfway and be like, yeah, you know what, there's reasons not to trust the government, but it's not necessarily because of these like oil reasons. There's direct reasons that we can look at how the government is supporting like whatever corporate interest or whatever it is. Like you can point to direct things and meet them halfway. That's what I often do, because I often will talk to like a lot of like far right people that I personally disagree with on a lot of political stuff, but I'll try and find some common ground to be like, hey, like, okay, you don't like the government either. Well, okay, let's talk about that. Or you feel economically that your future looks bleak. Let's talk about that. These are things that we can sort of discuss, and then we can
Yeah, this is also this is also something I've been trying to do, because I've had a lot of conversations. Conversations where I'm basically saying you're wrong, here's why, and that almost never works when you are conversation like that. No, I've been trying to do more like peeling back the layers and find some legitimate grievances that we both share, for example, and then we can build up a case from there, and perhaps we can find a common solution to that problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach.
Yeah,
because I think a lot of people tend, and it's hard to believe this sometimes with how like partisan and divided everything is, but a lot of people generally have a lot in common. Like a lot of people just want to live their lives. They just want to be happy. Like they just, if I'm driving in like a heavily red state and my car breaks down, people are going to come and help me. Like people generally are on the same page with a lot of things. So you just kind of find out like, what the commonalities are and build from that and build that kind of unity. And that is exactly this type of stuff that a lot of people don't want people to do in the first place. So I think that's why you should be doing it.
There's I've seen it said by multiple left-wing podcasters I listen to, is that the right and the left have a lot of common grievances. It's just not, it's the solutions that are typically the things where they differ. But a lot of people can agree that the government's corrupt. Our money's going, taxes are going towards like bombing other countries or what have you. And so absolutely, I totally agree with that. Also, we have a question about from Jarrett Peoples about the troll novel on your bookshelf.
Oh yeah, that's a book I wrote. If I can do a plug, I don't know.
Absolutely, feel
that's
free.
a book I wrote a couple of years ago. It's based on a lot of the stuff that we've been discussing today. So it's a novel. It's a work of fiction, but it is very heavily based on what we've been discussing and based on my research. So it's a book that covers kind of online conspiracy, online extremism, and what that kind of stuff looks like. So if you're interested in any of that kind of stuff, you can check that out.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. You can always shill with us, because that's that's what we do.
Other than the intention, but I guess I did display it there on purpose. So.
Actually, unless necessarily, do you have any more questions, or I don't see any questions?
Oh, I have no more questions, unless somebody in the comments have any questions. I
don't see any more at the moment.
Yeah.
Is there? Are there any other papers or work that you'd like to shill?
Check out the book. The paper that we've been discussing, it just came out. It's in a larger edited volume. So if you don't want to buy the whole volume, but if you're interested in reading about the history of Fashwave specifically, you can, I guess you can reach out to me directly and I can send it to you. So you can just Google me, and my contact info is pretty easy to find. So if you want to read that paper or that chapter, you can do that. And I've also written a couple of smaller articles on Fashwave that are publicly accessible and available. So if you just Google Fashwave and my name, I'm sure you'll be able to find them. So if you're interested in any of that kind of stuff, you can check that out.
I will put
I put a link to the
a
novel.
link.
I put the link to the novel
Oh,
in
thanks.
the chat.
Okay, yeah, I'll put it in the description also, so that when people watch later, they can see for your book.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us for the show today. We really appreciate it. This is a very interesting conversation.
Totally, a lot of fun. Happy to do it. Keep up the good work. I like the stuff your channel's been doing recently. So keep at it.
Oh, thank you. We've got a few biology videos that we need to finish for the Ancestors Tale series, and then it's off to the races on the political stuff, I guess. So, yeah, okay, all right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you everybody in the live chat for watching. And we will see all of you next time. So, bye everybody.